On the morning of August 7th, 1945, in a heavily guarded radio station on the island of Ceylon, a young Scottish woman named Jean Valentine pulled off her headphones and called for an officer. She was barely 20 years old, just 4 feet 10 inches tall, recruited because she was fast with puzzles and faster with numbers, and she had just copied down a Japanese transmission that made no sense at all. Hiroshima had been destroyed less than 24 hours earlier by a single bomb. An entire city had ceased to exist in the time it takes to blink. The British and the Americans believed, or at least hoped, that this would be the final blow, that Japan would now surrender, that the killing would stop. But the message in front of Jean suggested something else entirely. It suggested that somewhere inside the Japanese high command, the destruction of Hiroshima had not been received as a reason to surrender. It had been received as a reason to fight harder. And when the codebreakers around her finally translated what they were looking at, the conclusion they reached was worse than anyone in London wanted to admit.
Jean Valentine's own story stayed secret for almost 60 years. She was bound by the Official Secrets Act, the same as everyone working alongside her, and for decades she never told her own family what she had actually done in the Far East during the final weeks of the war. What she had done was help listen in on the private thoughts of a government that had just witnessed the most destructive weapon ever used in human history, and was still, in its own internal communications, talking about fighting on. She was working for an operation almost nobody has heard of, the Far East Combined Bureau, Britain's answer to Bletchley Park in the Pacific Theatre. By 1945, the teams there had spent years building up a skill far harder than simply translating Japanese. They understood the silences inside Japanese military language, the careful, deliberately ambiguous phrasing officers used when they wanted to say something without quite saying it. That skill is exactly what made the message Jean copied down so disturbing, because it was never meant to be heard by anyone outside the Japanese chain of command. It could not be propaganda. It could not be a bluff. It was Japan's military leadership talking to itself.
So what did it actually say? Days before Hiroshima, Japan's foreign minister, a man named Shigenori Togo, had sent a message to Japan's ambassador in Moscow, a message British intercept teams managed to obtain and translate almost in real time. Togo's words were not panic, they were grim, stubborn endurance. As long as Britain and America continued demanding unconditional surrender, he had written, Japan had no alternative but to see the war through to the end, whatever that end might be. And in the hours and days immediately following Hiroshima, the traffic Jean and her colleagues were intercepting carried that same tone forward, not backward. No language of capitulation, no signal that the bombing had broken anything, just the same grim commitment, now sitting next to a destroyed city, as if the destruction of Hiroshima had barely registered as a reason to change course. Read quickly, that sounds almost like stubbornness for its own sake. To analysts fluent in Japanese military understatement, it meant something specific. It meant the dominant faction inside Tokyo was not contemplating surrender, it was contemplating continuation. Which left the British with a question that was genuinely terrifying. If destroying an entire city in a single blast was not enough to break Japan's will to fight, what would be? And the answer they already had on file was worse than anyone wanted to hear out loud. For over a year, British and American intelligence had been tracking a Japanese plan called Ketsu Go, the Operation of Decision.
It was Japan's blueprint for defending the home islands if the Allies invaded, built on one brutal assumption, that the cost in Allied lives would be so catastrophic, so far beyond anything seen at Okinawa or Iwo Jima, that the Allies would eventually accept a negotiated peace rather than keep paying that price. This was active military doctrine. Civilians, including elderly men, women, and teenagers, were already being organized and in some cases armed with sharpened bamboo spears, trained with the explicit expectation that they would fight and die, defending their homeland street by street. Now hold that doctrine next to what Jean Valentine had just copied down. A weapon had just been used that should have made any rational military planner reconsider everything. Instead, the internal Japanese communication showed no sign of that reconsideration. If anything, some officers appeared to interpret the bombing not as proof that resistance was futile, but as proof the Allies had become desperate enough to use terror weapons, weapons a nation already committed to fighting to the last person might still be able to outlast.
This was the moment a handful of British officers in Ceylon reached a conclusion they were not allowed to share with almost anyone. Hiroshima alone might not be enough, and if that was true, the war was not entering its final days. It might be entering its most catastrophic phase yet. But here is what nobody in that radio room could have predicted. The next 9 days would bring a second bombing, a divided government on the edge of collapse, and finally an attempted military coup so close to succeeding that it could have erased everything the Allies thought they had just won. And teams like Jean's would be listening to every step of it. The secrecy around this work is part of why so few people have ever heard this story. Intelligence this sensitive went to an extraordinarily short list of people, a handful of commanders, a handful of officials in London. The vast majority of soldiers and sailors fighting in the Pacific had no idea this kind of work was happening at all, let alone what it was uncovering. So while the rest of the world allowed itself a flicker of hope after Hiroshima, the small teams in Ceylon were sitting with a far grimmer assessment, and they were almost completely alone with it.
That is exactly why the second bombing on Nagasaki on August 9th did not surprise the people inside that intelligence community, even though it shocked much of the wider public. There had been no clear sign of capitulation after Hiroshima. The military faction in Tokyo, the one with the actual power to keep the war going, had not moved. And then, in the days that followed Nagasaki, something British analysts could actually measure began to shift. The volume of Japanese military traffic changed. The urgency in diplomatic messages changed. Something inside Tokyo was finally cracking. But cracking is not the same as breaking cleanly, and what came next is the part of this story almost nobody knows. On the night of August 14th into the 15th, with Emperor Hirohito having already recorded a surrender announcement to be broadcast to the Japanese people, a group of young army officers made their move. Men still loyal to the doctrine of fighting to the last soldier, the last civilian, the last bamboo spear, attempted to seize the imperial palace itself, to find and destroy the recording before it could ever reach the airwaves. For several hours that night, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Had these officers succeeded, there is no telling what would have happened next. Ketsu Go, the doctrine of mass civilian sacrifice, was still fully in place, still fully resourced, still waiting. The coup failed. The recording survived. It was smuggled out and broadcast the following morning, August 15th, the date now remembered around the world as Victory over Japan Day. But for the British codebreakers who had spent those preceding days reading intercepted signals that pointed toward continued resistance, the relief that followed was tempered by something else entirely. A clear, cold understanding of exactly how close the war had come to dragging on in a form far more brutal than the public would ever fully appreciate. Jean Valentine went home after the war, married, raised a family, and said nothing. For nearly 60 years, the people closest to her had no idea that, as a teenager, she had helped intercept the private communications of a government deciding in real time whether millions of people were going to live or die. Her story only became public decades later, one of the last surviving voices able to describe what it actually felt like to read those messages as they came in, not knowing yet which way the war was about to break.
But the story does not end with that broadcast on August 15th. What almost nobody realized at the time was just how close Japan's own government had come to never reaching that surrender at all. Behind closed doors in Tokyo, the deadlock was tighter than even British intelligence could fully see in real time. Japan's Supreme War Council, the 6 men who effectively controlled the country's fate, remained split 3 against 3 on whether to surrender, even after a second city had been destroyed. It took an extraordinary step to break that deadlock. Emperor Hirohito himself intervening directly in a military decision, breaking centuries of tradition to cast what amounted to the deciding vote. Without that single intervention, the deadlock inside Tokyo could have continued indefinitely.
And the forces waiting on the other side of that deadlock were not small. Under a law passed that same summer, virtually every able-bodied man between 15 and 60 and every woman between 17 and 40 had been classified as part of Japan's Volunteer Fighting Corps, a civilian defense force numbering in the millions. Thousands of aircraft, many of them stripped-down trainers with barely enough fuel for a one-way flight, had been held in reserve specifically for the invasion, never used against Hiroshima or Nagasaki, kept hidden for the moment Allied troops finally came ashore. None of it was ever used, but all of it had been real, and all of it had been waiting, built around the same assumption British codebreakers had already uncovered in that very first intercepted message, that Japan intended to make any invasion so costly the Allies would eventually negotiate rather than finish what they started.
It is worth asking what would have happened if that one vote inside the Supreme War Council had gone differently, if Operation Downfall, the code name for the full invasion of the Japanese home islands, had gone ahead as planned, beginning with Operation Olympic against Kyushu in November 1945 and followed by Operation Coronet against the Tokyo Plain itself. Casualty estimates prepared for Allied commanders that summer ranged from staggering to almost unthinkable, with some projections suggesting losses on both sides combined could have exceeded everything the Pacific War had cost up to that point. That is the war Jean Valentine and the small teams around her were quietly working to help Allied commanders prepare for, right up until the moment it was no longer necessary. Jean Valentine's role in all of this was only formally recognized decades later when her wartime work was finally declassified and she began speaking publicly about those final weeks in Ceylon. She was far from the only one. Hundreds of men and women who served in the Far East Combined Bureau and its sister units lived out the rest of their lives never receiving public recognition for work that may have shaped the final days of the Second World War, simply because the rules they swore to follow never allowed them to say a word.
It changes the way you have to think about how World War II actually ended. The popular memory is simple: 2 bombs, then surrender, a clean and almost inevitable conclusion. But the intelligence picture British codebreakers were assembling in real time tells a far messier story. A story where the destruction of an entire city did not immediately bring a powerful military to its knees. A story where officers looked directly at evidence of an atomic weapon and still bet everything on continued sacrifice. A story that came within hours of a coup succeeding and pushing the war toward a ground invasion that planners on both sides expected to be the single bloodiest campaign of the entire conflict. Jean Valentine and the small teams working alongside her never fired a shot. They never stormed a beach. But in those final 9 days of August 1945, quietly, anonymously, listening to signals most people will never know existed, they may have given Allied commanders the warning they needed about exactly what kind of resistance was still waiting on the other side of that surrender broadcast. It is one of the last great hidden stories of the Second World War, and it is a reminder that the end of a war is rarely as clean or as immediate as the history books make it seem.